Hello, this week for discussion 3, we're asked what social welfare services are needed in rural areas, in our opinion, and why. So in my opinion, I think that more services on domestic violence are needed in rural areas due to the fact that there's not much research done on domestic violence. According to the text, it's estimated that between 4 million and 6 million women are affected each year. But still, there's not much research done on other intimate partner violence, like how men are affected, how other domestic situations, because domestic violence can be any type of family related or anyone who lives there, violence towards each other. So when I was doing my internship last semester, I attended domestic violence classes at my internship. And a lot of women and men would call in reporting domestic violence situations, and they would call in needing help or needing the classes, but then they wouldn't show up because they would go back to their partner, or they just figured there's no other resources for me, there's nowhere I can go or nothing I could do, so they would just end up going back, or they would just end up not reporting it altogether because they didn't want to go through the court processes and the restraining order process and things like that. So I think there should be much more resources for people in domestic violence situations, such as confidential shelters, because in the text it also states that some shelters in rural areas, people know the address, and you're not supposed to know the address unless you are going to that domestic violence shelter. In my community, I'm not even sure if there is a domestic violence shelter. If there is, I'm pretty sure it's known by the community where it is. And that's just a safety issue, because the abuser could find out where the person is and go to that shelter and endanger everyone that's in that shelter, knowing where it is. So I think there should be more resources for confidential shelters. There should also be more resources for access to housing and jobs and things like that for people who are in domestic violence situations, because most of the time they end up going back to their abuser because they have nowhere to go, they don't have any funds, they don't work, or they can't work. And in rural areas, there's limited resources in the first place. There's limited jobs, there's limited housing, there's limited access to resources, limited transportation. So I think there should be more domestic violence help for people in that situation. Especially in rural areas, it's not much reported in the first place, because if the community's small, they don't want it getting out in the community that they're in that type of situation, because of the embarrassment, the scrutiny, and people most of the time tend to think that they're lying because they haven't seen it themselves. And I've seen that in most cases. My family, especially my mother, she was in domestic violence situations, and the number one reason she kept going back was because she didn't know that there was resources or couldn't find them, or the housing that the domestic violence shelters provided was inadequate. And also because some housing places are limited on who they can house, and they have limited space. So some people are turned away because they don't have the space for them at the moment. So it's either they go back to their abuser or they're homeless. So I really do think that we should have more resources for domestic violence. Also, more funding should be provided for things like that, and more research should be done, in my opinion. Because at my internship, we only had 2 ladies that were working in the domestic violence area, and one of them could be full-time and the other one could be part-time, because they didn't have the funding to provide 2 full-time staff for a domestic violence area. So I thought that was a little bit odd, but at the same time, they told us that they didn't get as much calls as the other areas in the internship, so that's why the funding was not as much. But I do feel like there should have been more funding so they could do more for the people in those situations, because when they're told, oh, we offer classes and we can give you resources to shelters, some of them don't want to take that.